As one of the most notorious figures of the 80s, televangelist Jim Bakker reemerged from a headline-making scandal to stir the pot with multiple other controversies over the next few decades.
Once celebrated as one of the most influential voices in televangelism, Pastor Jim Bakker built an empire that reached millions of homes across America. But behind the cameras and massive donations, questions began to surface that would eventually shake everything he built. From luxury projects to shocking scandals, his rise carried shadows many never noticed. How did a trusted preacher end up at the center of so much controversy? And what was really happening behind the spotlight? The making of a televangelism superstar. Long before controversy surrounded his name, Jim Bakker was viewed as one of the fastest-rising figures in religious broadcasting. Together with his wife, Tammy Faye Bakker, he helped create a television ministry that quickly captured the attention of audiences across America. Their energy, emotional style, and unique approach made them stand out from many traditional preachers of the time. Instead of focusing only on sermons, they blended faith with entertainment, interviews, music, and personal conversations that made viewers feel deeply connected to them. As television became more powerful inside American homes, the Bakkers understood how to use it in ways few religious figures had managed before. Millions of people began tuning in regularly, turning Jim and Tammy Faye into recognizable faces far beyond church communities. Their growing popularity helped transform their program into something much bigger than a small ministry. What started as religious broadcasting slowly evolved into a massive televangelism movement, with influence stretching across the country. One of the biggest turning points came through the PTL Club, short for Praise the Lord. The program became extremely successful and attracted huge audiences who not only watched faithfully, but also donated large amounts of money to support the ministry. Viewers believed they were contributing to a mission that was spreading hope and faith to millions. As support increased, the ministry expanded rapidly, and so did Jim Bakker's influence. But success on that level also brought enormous wealth. Reports began describing a lifestyle that looked far removed from the modest image many expected from religious leaders. Expensive purchases, luxurious properties, and extravagant living slowly became part of the public conversation surrounding the Bakkers. While supporters admired the ministry's growth, critics quietly started asking how so much money was being spent behind the scenes. Still, none of those concerns appeared strong enough to slow the momentum. In fact, Jim Bakker continued pushing forward with even bigger ambitions. One of the most famous examples was Heritage USA, a massive Christian-themed attraction built in South Carolina near Charlotte, North Carolina. The project was designed as more than just a church property. It included hotels, entertainment areas, campgrounds, shopping spaces, and family activities that drew huge crowds from across the country. To many supporters, Heritage USA felt inspiring and groundbreaking. Families traveled there believing they were experiencing a place built around faith and community. At its peak, the property attracted millions of visitors and became one of the most well-known religious destinations in America. The scale of the project shocked many people, especially because it rivaled some major entertainment resorts during that time. But behind the excitement and rapid expansion, warning signs were quietly beginning to appear. Questions slowly emerged about finances, fundraising methods, and whether the ministry had grown too large too quickly. Some critics wondered if the focus had shifted away from religion and toward building a powerful business empire, supported by loyal followers and constant donations. Even so, Jim Bakker's image remained incredibly strong in the public eye. To millions of viewers, he still represented success, faith, and inspiration. Few people could have imagined that the same empire appearing so untouchable on television was already heading toward a storm that would soon change everything. The empire that raised questions behind the scenes. As Jim Bakker's influence continued growing, the ministry around him became far larger and more complicated than most viewers realized. What many people saw on television was a polished world filled with uplifting messages, emotional prayers, and smiling audiences. But behind the scenes, the operation was expanding at an incredible speed, bringing in enormous amounts of money from supporters who believed they were helping build something meaningful and lasting. Donations poured in from viewers across the country. Some supporters mailed cash, while others sent expensive gifts, jewelry, property deeds, and personal valuables to the ministry. The level of financial support shocked even people working inside the organization. Over time, the ministry began operating more like a giant corporation than a traditional religious program. The growth looked impressive from the outside, but managing such a massive empire created increasing pressure behind closed doors. At the center of this expansion stood Heritage USA, the enormous Christian retreat and entertainment destination that had become one of Jim Bakker's proudest achievements. The property kept growing with hotels, campgrounds, shopping areas, restaurants, and attractions designed to draw even larger crowds. To supporters, it appeared to be proof that the ministry was thriving beyond imagination. But maintaining such a huge operation required constant funding, and that pressure only continued increasing as the years went on. One of the ministry's biggest fundraising strategies involved selling what were called lifetime partnerships. Supporters were encouraged to contribute around $1,000 in exchange for promised yearly stays at Heritage USA accommodations. To many followers, it sounded like an exciting opportunity to support the ministry, while also becoming part of something special for their families. But serious concerns eventually started surfacing about how those partnerships were being handled. Reports later revealed that far more memberships had been sold than the available hotel rooms could realistically support. Critics questioned whether promises were being made that the ministry could never fully deliver. As more people looked closely at the numbers, doubts surrounding the operation slowly became harder to ignore. At the same time, public attention toward Jim and Tammy Faye's luxurious lifestyle continued growing. Media reports described expensive purchases and extravagant living that seemed to clash with the image of humble ministry work many supporters expected. Stories about lavish spending began appearing more frequently, causing some former admirers to wonder where donation money was truly going. Even inside religious communities, questions started spreading. Some people defended Bakker completely, arguing that successful ministries naturally required money and expansion. Others believed the ministry had become too focused on wealth, image, and power. Still, despite the growing criticism, millions of loyal viewers continued standing by him. To them, Jim Bakker remained a trusted religious leader who had transformed Christian television forever. But the atmosphere surrounding the ministry was beginning to change. What once felt untouchable was now attracting closer public attention. Investigators, reporters, and critics were becoming increasingly interested in what was happening behind the scenes. The same fame that helped Jim Bakker rise to the top was now placing every decision under a microscope. And then, just as financial concerns were already creating pressure around the ministry, a far more explosive controversy suddenly emerged, one that would completely transform public perception of Jim Bakker and push his empire into a crisis unlike anything it had faced before: the scandal that shattered the image. Just as Jim Bakker's ministry was operating at its peak visibility, a wave of controversy emerged that would completely alter how the public viewed him. What had once been a carefully built image of success, faith, and influence suddenly became surrounded by suspicion and intense media attention. For years, he had been seen as a trusted figure in religious broadcasting, but now that trust was beginning to fracture in a very public way. The turning point came when allegations surfaced involving an encounter with Jessica Hahn, a church secretary who was only 21 at the time. Reports later revealed that the incident had taken place several years earlier, but it was only in the late 1980s that the story became widely known. Once the details entered public discussion, the reaction was immediate and explosive, drawing national attention across television networks and newspapers. What made the situation even more controversial was the financial dimension tied to it. Investigations and reports suggested that a large sum of money was paid in what was described as hush compensation to keep the matter from becoming public. This detail intensified scrutiny around the ministry, as questions began forming not just about personal behavior, but also about how church funds were being used behind closed doors. Jessica Hahn eventually spoke publicly about her experience, and her account added even more weight to the growing controversy. As her story spread through interviews and media coverage, it fueled national debate and placed Jim Bakker at the center of one of the most talked-about religious scandals of the time. What had once been hidden was now being discussed openly, and the attention showed no signs of slowing down. As headlines grew louder, the media quickly shifted its focus. The same television presence that once celebrated Bakker's rise was now covering his downfall in real time. News outlets analyzed every detail, while commentators debated the implications of the allegations. For many viewers who had followed his ministry for years, the news was shocking and difficult to process. Supporters of Jim Bakker were divided. Some struggled to believe the accusations and continued to stand by him, insisting that the situation was being misunderstood or misrepresented. Others, however, began distancing themselves, feeling disappointed and uncertain about what to believe. The unity that once surrounded his ministry started to break apart as public confidence weakened. At the same time, investigations began expanding beyond the scandal itself. Authorities started examining the financial operations of the ministry more closely, looking into donations, expenditures, and internal records. What began as a single controversy was now evolving into a much larger inquiry into how the entire organization had been managed. As pressure increased, the situation reached a critical point. Questions about finances, accountability, and decision-making became impossible to ignore. The ministry that once appeared unstoppable was now under intense legal and public scrutiny, and every new discovery added more tension to an already collapsing image. Before long, the investigation moved from media speculation into formal legal action. What had started as controversy and public debate was now entering a far more serious phase involving federal authorities and courtroom proceedings, and as the case escalated, Jim Bakker found himself facing consequences that would reshape not only his ministry, but his entire future, leading directly into a battle that would unfold inside the courtroom. The investigations that changed everything. As the controversy surrounding Jim Bakker deepened, what had once been public discussion and media speculation began shifting into formal legal scrutiny. The ministry that had grown into a massive religious empire was now under the watchful eye of investigators, and every layer of its financial operations started to come under examination. What once looked like a thriving organization was now being carefully pulled apart piece by piece. Authorities began looking closely at how money flowed through the ministry. Donations that had poured in from millions of supporters were now being traced, analyzed, and questioned. Reports of questionable deductions, large personal expenses, and unclear financial practices began surfacing as investigators dug deeper into records that had previously been hidden from public view. The scale of the inquiry quickly grew beyond what many had expected. What made the situation even more serious was that the investigation was no longer limited to just rumors or isolated claims. Federal authorities became involved, and the case expanded into a full legal examination of fraud, financial misconduct, and misuse of resources. The ministry was no longer being viewed only as a religious organization, but as a large financial operation that required accountability under the law. As details continued to emerge, the public reaction intensified. News outlets reported extensively on the findings, and each new development added more pressure to an already collapsing image. For many people who had supported Jim Bakker for years, the revelations were difficult to accept. The idea that a trusted religious leader could be tied to such serious financial allegations created widespread shock and confusion. Inside the ministry, the pressure was just as overwhelming. Key figures who had once supported the leadership began stepping away as the situation escalated. Leadership changes followed, and control of the organization shifted as concerns grew about its future stability. What had once been a tightly controlled and rapidly expanding empire was now unraveling under legal and public pressure. Eventually, the investigation reached its most critical stage. Formal charges were filed, marking a turning point that transformed the situation from inquiry to prosecution. Jim Bakker was accused of serious offenses, including fraud and conspiracy, tied to the handling of donations and ministry funds. The charges represented a dramatic escalation that placed his entire legacy in jeopardy. Court proceedings soon followed, bringing the controversy into an entirely new setting. Instead of television studios and ministry stages, Bakker now faced courtrooms filled with lawyers, judges, and legal arguments. The environment was starkly different from the world he had once controlled. Every detail of the case was examined under strict legal standards, and the consequences carried far-reaching implications. As the trial progressed, public attention remained intense. People across the country followed updates closely, trying to understand how such a well-known religious figure had ended up in the center of a federal case. Supporters and critics continued to clash in public opinion, but the legal process moved forward regardless of divided views. Eventually, the courtroom reached a decisive moment that would define the outcome of the entire investigation. A verdict was delivered, and with it came consequences that permanently changed the course of Jim Bakker's life and ministry. The empire he had spent years building was now facing collapse, and the chapter of his public rise seemed to have reached its end. But even as the legal battle concluded, the story did not fully end there. Because what came next was something few people expected: a return, a rebuilding, and a new chapter that would once again place Jim Bakker back into public attention, but under an entirely different image and message. The return that sparked new controversy. After the courtroom proceedings concluded and the dust of the legal battles began to settle, many assumed Jim Bakker's public life had finally reached its final chapter. His name had become closely tied to scandal, investigations, and one of the most widely discussed collapses in televangelism history. From the outside, it looked like there was no realistic path back to influence or visibility. The empire he once built had already fallen apart, and the public spotlight had shifted elsewhere. For a time, Bakker did step away from the level of national attention he once commanded. The years following his conviction were marked by silence, reflection, and a dramatic shift away from the massive platforms he once controlled. Many believed this was the end of his influence entirely, a final exit from the world of religious broadcasting that had defined his career for so long. But over time, something unexpected began to happen. Slowly and quietly, Jim Bakker started reappearing in ministry spaces again. It was not an instant return to fame or a dramatic comeback tour. Instead, it unfolded gradually through smaller platforms, limited broadcasts, and new religious programming that introduced him to audiences in a different way than before. Eventually, he returned to television with a revived version of his ministry. The format was familiar in some ways, but the tone had noticeably changed. Instead of the optimism and prosperity-driven messaging that once defined his earlier work, his new appearances often carried a more urgent and warning-focused tone. He spoke frequently about global instability, preparation, and the need for spiritual readiness in uncertain times. Alongside this shift in messaging came another controversial development. His ministry began promoting survival products and preparedness items, ranging from food storage supplies to emergency kits. These offerings were presented as practical solutions for uncertain futures, but they quickly attracted attention and debate. Supporters viewed them as helpful tools for preparedness, while critics questioned whether fear was being used as a motivator for sales. As his platform slowly regained visibility, public reaction became divided once again. Some viewers saw his return as a story of redemption, believing that people deserve second chances regardless of their past mistakes. To them, Jim Bakker represented someone who had fallen, faced consequences, and attempted to rebuild his life in a new direction. They continued to support his ministry and followed his broadcasts with renewed interest. However, others were far more skeptical. For many critics, his return raised unresolved questions that had never fully disappeared. They pointed back to his past controversies, financial scandals, and legal history as reasons to remain cautious. In their view, the reemergence of his ministry did not erase earlier concerns, but instead reopened old debates about trust, accountability, and responsibility. As his presence in media continued, one thing became increasingly clear. Jim Bakker's story had not settled into a simple conclusion. Instead, it had evolved into something more complicated, where past events and present actions constantly overlapped. Every new appearance brought both attention and criticism, keeping his name in public discussion even decades after his initial rise. Even more recently, his ministry drew renewed controversy during global crises, when claims and promotions related to health solutions sparked legal warnings and public backlash. These incidents once again placed him under scrutiny, reminding audiences that his influence still carried the ability to generate strong reactions, both supportive and critical. In the end, Jim Bakker's return did not deliver a clear resolution or a universally accepted redemption story. Instead, it created another layer in a long and complicated public narrative. Some saw transformation, others saw repetition of old patterns, and many remained unsure where the truth fully stood. And so the question remains open even today. When a public figure rises, falls under intense scrutiny, and then returns to the spotlight, does that represent genuine change, or simply another chapter in the same ongoing story? Thanks for watching. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more deep dives into untold stories and controversial figures from history and beyond.